Welcome. Get comfortable. Settle in. Take a deep breath and relax. Tonight, we're going on a journey through time. We're traveling back to the 1800s, a century that saw extraordinary change. The Industrial Revolution transformed how people worked and lived. Empires expanded across the globe. Science and medicine made remarkable advances. Democracy spread to more nations. Literature, art, and music flourished. In many ways, it was a century of progress. But progress for some came at a terrible cost for others. Tonight, we're not going to focus on the triumphs of the 1800s. We're going to explore its shadows. We're going to look at practices that were perfectly legal at the time, things that the law not only permitted, but often actively protected and facilitated, things that we now recognize as crimes against humanity, as violations of the most basic, human rights. But in the 1800s, they were simply the way things were done. What you're about to hear might be difficult. These are stories of exploitation, violence, and systematic cruelty, but they're important stories to understand. They show us how law and morality aren't always the same thing. They reveal how legal systems can be designed to protect the powerful and exploit the vulnerable. They demonstrate that what one era considers normal and acceptable, another era can recognize as monstrous. As you listen tonight, remember that the people who suffered through these systems were real. They had hopes and dreams. They felt pain and fear. They loved their families and wanted better lives. And the legal systems of their time offered them little or no protection. In fact, those systems often trapped them in situations of abuse and exploitation, making escape impossible. But also remember that change was possible. Every single practice we'll discuss tonight was eventually challenged, reformed, or abolished. It took courage. It took activists and reformers who refused to accept that legal meant right. It took ordinary people standing up and saying this is wrong, even when the law said otherwise. It took decades, sometimes centuries. But change came. So as you relax and prepare to drift off to sleep, let these stories wash over you. Don't let them weigh you down. Let them deepen your understanding of history, of how far we've come, and of how important it is to remain vigilant. Because law is not fixed, it evolves. And we all have a role in shaping what it becomes. Take another deep breath. Relax your shoulders. Let your body sink into comfort. We're about to begin our journey through 100 facts about crimes that were technically legal in the 1800s. Let's start at the beginning with one of the darkest chapters in human history. Segment 1: Chattel Slavery and the Slave Trade in the early 1800s. Let's start with what chattel slavery actually meant during this period. In the early 1800s, enslaved Africans and their descendants were legally treated as movable property. The word chattel comes from the same root as cattle, and that gives you a sense of how the law viewed these human beings. They could be bought, sold, inherited, or even mortgaged, just like furniture or livestock. Enslaved people had virtually no legal rights against their owners. While the Atlantic slave trade had reached its peak in the late 1700s, it was still very much operating in the early 1800s. In fact, it continued legally or semi-legally into the mid-19th century in various parts of the Americas. This wasn't ancient history. This was happening while Jane Austen was writing her novels, while Beethoven was composing symphonies, while the Industrial Revolution was transforming Europe. Now, let's talk about the scale of this forced deportation. The numbers are staggering and difficult to fully comprehend. Historians estimate that between about 1501 and 1867, roughly 12 to 13 million Africans were forced onto ships as part of the transatlantic slave trade. Of those millions, about 10 to 10.7 million survived the journey to land in the Americas. Think about that for a moment. That means somewhere between 2 and 3 million people died before ever reaching their destination. A significant share of this total was transported in the decades just before and after 1800, when the trade was at its height and still highly profitable. These weren't small operations. They were legally protected by European powers and conducted on a massive industrial scale, which brings us to the major European slave trading powers involved in this system. Portugal and later Brazil were the largest overall transporters of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. Following them were Britain, Spain, France, and the Netherlands, all operating extensive legal slave trading networks throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries. By the late 1700s, Britain had become the dominant slaving power. The British were responsible for roughly a quarter of all transatlantic shipments. When we look specifically at enslaved people who ended up in North America, Britain was responsible for transporting up to half of them. British ships, British merchants, British ports, all legally participating in what we now recognize as one of history's greatest crimes against humanity. Where did all these people end up? This is something that surprises many people today. Most enslaved Africans were not taken to what is now the United States. The vast majority ended up in Brazil and the Caribbean. These regions absorbed the largest shares of the trade because of the massive sugar and coffee plantations there. The work was so brutal and the mortality rates so high that plantation owners constantly needed new workers. Only about 4 to 5% of all enslaved Africans transported to the Americas disembarked in what became the United States. That's still hundreds of thousands of people, of course, and slavery in the United States would later become highly politically prominent, ultimately leading to a civil war. But when we're looking at the full scope of the transatlantic slave trade, the Caribbean and South America were the primary destinations. For many captives, the nightmare began long before they ever saw a ship. Let's talk about capture and inland trafficking in Africa. The ordeal often started far from the coast. Raiding parties and wars produced prisoners who were then marched long distances to coastal trading posts. These posts were called factories, and they were controlled by both African and European intermediaries. The journey to the coast could take weeks or even months, chained together in coffles with minimal food and water. Scholars estimate that a large share of those trafficked in the 18th and early 19th centuries were originally free people. They weren't prisoners of war in any traditional sense. They had been kidnapped or seized in warfare that was specifically conducted to capture people for sale into the Atlantic trade. Entire communities were destabilized and disrupted by this constant threat of kidnapping and warfare. Once captives reached the coast and were loaded onto ships, they faced what historians call the Middle Passage. The conditions were almost unimaginable. Captives were crammed into overcrowded holds below deck, often unable to even sit up straight. They were chained, sometimes in pairs, sometimes in larger groups. They were deprived of adequate food and water. The sanitation was non-existent. Diseases spread rapidly in these conditions. Dysentery, smallpox, and other illnesses swept through the holds, producing extremely high death rates. In the early centuries of the trade, mortality aboard ship averaged above 20%. By around 1800, improvements in sailing speed and some changes in conditions meant the rate fell to around 10%. In the final decades of the trade, it was roughly 5%. Now, 5% might sound almost acceptable until you remember the scale we're talking about. That still meant hundreds of thousands of deaths at sea over the course of the trade. People died, and their bodies were simply thrown overboard. Here's what makes all of this even more disturbing from a legal perspective. In the early 1800s, European and American legal systems recognized enslaved people as property. That means actions like capture, transport, whipping, branding, and forced sale were all lawful commercial activities. They weren't crimes. They were business. Ports, insurance companies, and courts in leading trading cities treated slave voyages and enslaved bodies as ordinary assets within the legal economy. In Liverpool, in Charleston, in Lisbon, you could insure a cargo of enslaved people just like you would insure a shipment of sugar or cotton. If enslaved people died during the voyage, it was treated as a loss of cargo, not as murder. The legal systems of the most advanced nations on Earth treated human beings as things not now. There's an important distinction we need to understand about abolition. The British Parliament outlawed British participation in the transatlantic slave trade in 1807. The United States banned the importation of enslaved Africans, effective in 1808. But here's the key point. These measures did not end slavery itself. They ended the legal importation of enslaved people from Africa, but slavery continued in both countries. After 1808, the Atlantic trade continued illegally, or under other flags. Ships would fly false colors or register in countries that hadn't banned the trade yet. And in the United States, a large, legally protected domestic slave trade moved more than 1 million enslaved people from the Upper South to the Deep South between 1808 and the Civil War. Families were torn apart. People were marched in chains. From Virginia and Maryland to Mississippi and Louisiana, all of it perfectly legal under American law. Why did this system persist for so long? Part of the answer lies in economics. Profits from the slave trade and slave-based plantation economies fueled the growth of port cities, banking, insurance, and industrial development in Europe and the Americas. By around 1800, a large share of Britain's overseas commerce was tied to Africa and the Americas. Banks lent money secured by enslaved people. Insurance companies underwrote slave voyages. Manufacturers depended on slave-grown cotton. The legal, slave economy was deeply embedded in global trade networks. Powerful economic interests had a stake in keeping the system going, and they used their influence to protect it in law and policy. Finally, let's consider the human toll and long-term consequences of all this. The numbers we've discussed so far are already staggering, but they only tell part of the story. Researchers estimate that millions more Africans died during capture, forced marches, holding facilities, and the early years of enslavement than those who reached the Americas alive. The full death toll is far higher than shipboard statistics alone can capture. And beyond the immediate deaths, the transatlantic slave trade and early 19th century chattel slavery left, enduring legacies that continue to shape our world. Today, racial hierarchy, economic inequality, cultural disruption on both sides of the Atlantic. Communities in Africa were devastated by centuries of slave raiding. Communities in the Americas were built on stolen labor and inherited the poisonous legacy of racial caste. These aren't just historical facts. They're part of the foundation of the modern world. Take a deep breath. These are heavy topics, and it's important to remember them, even as we try to relax. History isn't always comfortable, but understanding. It helps us understand the world we live in now. Rest easy, and we'll continue our journey. Segment 2. Systematic exploitation of colonized populations. Let's continue our journey through history. In this segment, we'll explore another system that was perfectly legal in the 1800s, the systematic exploitation of colonized populations. As European empires expanded across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, they created legal frameworks that allowed them to extract resources and labor on a massive scale. First, let's understand the legal basis for colonial conquest. European powers needed some kind of justification for taking over other people's lands, and they created doctrines to make it all seem legitimate. One of the most important was called terra nullius, a Latin phrase meaning nobody's land. European lawyers argued that if a territory wasn't being used in ways Europeans recognized as proper, if there weren't farms and cities that looked European, then the land was legally vacant and could simply be taken. Another justification was the so-called civilizing mission. Europeans claimed they had a duty to bring Christianity, modern government, and European culture to what they considered backward peoples. These ideas allowed them to treat vast territories in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific as legally available for seizure without the consent of the people already living there. By the 1880s, during what historians call the Scramble for Africa, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and Portugal claimed nearly the entire continent. They did this through treaties that were often coerced at gunpoint or simply fabricated. And here's the remarkable thing. All of this was embedded in international law at the time. The legal systems of the era recognized these conquests as legitimate. Once territories were claimed, colonial administrations needed labor to build their empires and extract resources. This brings us to forced labor regimes as standard policy. Colonial governments imposed what were called corvée labor systems. These required indigenous people to work on roads, railways, plantations, and mines without pay. The colonial authorities justified this as tribute or public duty under local ordinances they had written themselves. One of the most notorious examples was the Belgian Congo under King Leopold II, who personally controlled the territory from 1885 to 1908. The force publique, Leopold's private army, legally conscripted millions of Congolese people for rubber extraction. They set quotas that villages had to meet, and if they failed, the force publique would enforce compliance through mutilation, cutting off hands as punishment. Yet all of this was recognized as the legitimate exercise of sovereign authority. Leopold wasn't breaking any international laws. He was operating within the legal framework of the time. Colonial governments also developed a clever system to force people into wage labor through punitive taxation. Administrations enacted hut taxes, poll taxes, and head taxes that had to be paid in cash. This was a problem for indigenous populations because traditional economies used barter, trading goods and services without money. If you had to pay a tax in cash, but your economy didn't use cash, you had only one option: go work for wages on European plantations or in European mines. Britain's hut tax in Sierra Leone, introduced in 1898, and France's impot decapitation, or head tax, in West Africa drove mass displacement into exploitative jobs. People who had been subsistence farmers, growing food for their families, were forced into a cash economy they had never asked for. The colonial governments were legally collecting revenue while simultaneously breaking up traditional ways of life and funneling people into systems of exploitation. Of course, not everyone went along quietly, which brings us to violent pacification. Campaigns. When indigenous populations resisted colonial rule, European powers sent military expeditions to pacify them. These campaigns involved massacres, burning entire villages, and scorched earth tactics that destroyed crops and killed livestock. All of this was authorized under colonial martial law as necessary for maintaining order. One of the most horrific examples was Germany's genocide of the Herero and Nama peoples in German Southwest Africa, in what is now Namibia. Between 1904 and 1908, though rooted in policies from the 1890s, German forces killed tens of thousands of people through concentration camps, forced marches into the desert, and deliberate starvation. Historians now recognize this as genocide, but at the time, it was legally framed as counterinsurgency, as restoring order to a rebellious territory. The international community largely looked the other way. Land seizures for settler. Plantations were another key part of the colonial system. Authorities would expropriate the most fertile lands through legal surveys and eminent domain, then reallocate them to white settlers or give them as concessions to European companies. Indigenous groups were confined to marginal reserves, often on poor land that couldn't support their populations. In British Kenya, from the 1900s through the 1920s, colonial authorities took over 5 million acres for white highlands farms. The Kikuyu people, who had lived on and farmed these lands, were dispossessed under the Crown Lands Ordinance of 1902. This wasn't theft in the legal sense, at least not according to British colonial law. It was a lawful reallocation of property. The fact that it destroyed communities and ways of life that had existed for centuries didn't matter under the law. Colonial codes also allowed for child and family conscription. Authorities could draft entire families, including children as young as 10 years old, into unpaid labor pools for infrastructure projects. Often this meant separating families from their villages, breaking up communities. France's indigenate system in Algeria and Indochina, operating from the 1880s onward, mandated child labor for public works. The colonial authorities treated it as a parental civic obligation, something parents were required to provide. If families refused, they could be fined or imprisoned. 10-year-old children building roads and digging ditches, all perfectly legal under French colonial law. European companies received extraordinary privileges through resource extraction monopolies. Chartered companies like Britain's Royal Niger Company or Belgium's Congo Free State held legal concessions to monopolize valuable resources like ivory, rubber, and minerals. These companies could compel local populations to harvest and deliver quotas under armed oversight. What made these companies particularly powerful was that they exercised what we would normally think of as government powers. They had their own courts, their own police forces, their own armies. They could arrest people, try them, and punish them, all in service of forcing people to extract resources. This made forced extraction a state-backed commercial enterprise. Private profit backed by public force, all operating within a legal framework. The great infrastructure projects of empire were built on coerced labor. Railways, ports, and telegraph lines were essential to colonial control, allowing troops and administrators to move quickly and communicate across vast distances. The Uganda Railway, built between 1896 and 1901, relied on tens of thousands of workers brought in from India, China, and recruited locally in Africa. Thousands of these workers died from disease, exhaustion, and accidents. British law classified these as voluntary contracts, despite the fact that many workers were recruited through debt traps, where they were told they owed money and had to work it off, or through outright violence and coercion. The legal fiction of voluntary contract work disguised what was really happening. The human cost of all this exploitation was staggering. Let's talk about demographic and health devastation. Exploitation have populations in the hardest hit areas. Through overwork, famine resulting from land loss, and diseases introduced by Europeans against which indigenous populations had no immunity. Colonial censuses often underreported deaths to avoid scrutiny from humanitarian critics back in Europe. The Congo Free State's rubber terror during the 1890s and 1900s is estimated to have caused 10 million deaths. 10 million. Yet Leopold's government denied there was any problem, claiming it was simply legal administration of a territory. The horror was hidden behind the language of law and order. Finally, when people did resist these systems, their resistance was suppressed as treason. Revolts against colonial exploitation were prosecuted as high treason under colonial penal codes. Leaders were executed or exiled, and the legal framework that enabled the exploitation was preserved. The Maji-Maji Rebellion in German East Africa, which lasted from 1905 to 1907, saw somewhere between 75,000 and 300,000 Africans killed in German retaliatory campaigns. The Germans used famine as a weapon, destroying crops and food stores. Officially, this was reframed as restoring lawful order. The people who died were victims of state violence. They were criminals and rebels who had violated the law. What we're seeing in all of these examples is how law can be used to legitimize exploitation. These weren't rogue actors operating outside the law. They were operating within it, protected by it, enabled by it. The legal systems of the 19th century didn't just permit this exploitation, they actively facilitated it. And the legacy of these systems continues to shape our world today in patterns of global inequality, in the borders of nations, in economic relationships between the global North and South. Segment 3. Judicial Corporal Punishment and Public Torture. Let's shift our focus now to a different aspect of 19th century legal practice: judicial corporal punishment and public torture. These were not underground practices or secret abuses. They were official sentences handed down by courts, carried out in public spaces, and considered completely lawful forms of justice. To understand these practices, we need to look at their historical origins and legal rationale. These punishments traced back to medieval European traditions, where inflicting public pain and shame was thought to restore social order and extract confessions from the accused. By the 19th century, these practices had been codified in penal codes and were actually viewed as humane alternatives to execution. Think about that for a moment. Lawmakers and judges considered these punishments merciful, because they didn't kill the offender. English common law and statutes viewed corporal punishment as proportionate retribution for crimes. Judges were empowered to order these punishments for theft, forgery, and what were called moral offenses, crimes against public decency or morality. There was no right of appeal for these sentences. Once a judge ordered you to the pillory or the whipping post, that was final. Let's talk about the pillory as public spectacle. In England, the pillory was one of the most common forms of corporal punishment. It was a wooden device that locked the offender's head and hands in place, holding them immobile. These pillories were set up in busy market squares, the most public places in a town or city. The convicted person would be locked in the pillory for hours or even days, exposed to whatever the crowd wanted to do to them. And crowds did plenty. People threw rotten food, stones, mud, and excrement at pilloried offenders. Sometimes the violence escalated far beyond throwing things. People would beat pilloried offenders, stab them, or leave them exposed to the elements until they died. This was a standard sentence until it was abolished by the Pillory Abolition Act of 1837. In the early 1800s, over 3,000 cases yearly were sentenced to the pillory in England alone for crimes like perjury and libel. Standing in a town square with your head and hands locked in wood, while thousands of your neighbors threw garbage and rocks at you, all because you lied in court or wrote something considered defamatory. Flogging and whipping practices were even more common. Courts ordered lashes with a device called the cat-o'-nine tails. This was a whip with multiple leather thongs, sometimes 9 of them, hence the name. Sometimes courts ordered birch rods instead, thin, flexible branches that would cut into the skin. These punishments were administered on bare backs, buttocks, or legs by constables or prison staff, either in public or inside jails, which is what the British called jails. British naval and military flogging peaked in the early 1800s. A sailor or soldier could receive up to 48 lashes for a single offense. The punishment was legally justified as necessary for discipline. It was routinely applied to sailors in the Royal Navy, soldiers in the British Army, and convicts who were being transported to Australia. The person being flogged would be tied to a post or a grating, stripped to the waist, and then whipped while other sailors, soldiers, or convicts were forced to watch as a warning. Branding as permanent marking was another form of corporal punishment. That served as both immediate pain and lifelong stigma. Authorities would heat irons until they glowed red, then press them against the offender's skin, burning letters into their flesh. A T for thief, an M for manslayer, which meant someone who had killed another person, but not in a way that counted as murder under the law. These brands were placed on cheeks, hands, or shoulders, anywhere they would be visible. The idea was to prevent reoffending by making criminals visibly identifiable forever. You couldn't hide your past if it was literally burned into your face. English law mandated branding until reforms in the 1820s finally began to phase it out. The statutes detailed exactly how the procedure should be carried out, what temperature the iron should be, how long it should be held against the skin. In the colonies, like Australia, branding continued into the 1830s and was used on escaped convicts to make them easier to identify if they were recaptured. Many of these punishments took place at public execution sites as punishment hubs. The same locations used for hangings were used for whipping, branding, and the pillory. Sites like London's Tyburn or Newgate Prison combined the fear of death with visible suffering to maximize the deterrent effect on crowds. The authorities believed that if people saw others being punished horribly, they would be less likely to commit crimes themselves. During jail delivery sessions in the early 1800s, which were when courts would process large numbers of cases at once, hundreds of people annually were sentenced to the whipping post, either after an execution or alongside hangings. These events drew enormous crowds, sometimes 10,000 spectators or more. It was entertainment as well as justice, a public festival of pain. These punishments weren't limited to adult men. Let's discuss the application to women and juveniles. Women received whippings too, though they were usually carried out inside prisons rather than in public, supposedly to preserve the women's modesty. Boys under 16 faced birchings, though by 19th century rules these were limited to 12. Strokes. All of this was court-ordered and legally sanctioned. In England and British India, vagrancy acts routinely punished female vagrants and child thieves with corporal punishment. If you were a homeless woman or a 10-year-old boy caught stealing bread, you could be legally whipped. This was embedded in juvenile justice systems until mid-century reforms finally began to question whether beating children was really the best approach to criminal justice. These practices weren't unique to England. Colonial and global variations existed throughout the world. France used something called the palanque, which was a flogging frame, publicly until 1845. Russia and Ottoman territories employed knouting, which used heavy whips that caused deep lacerations, cutting into muscle, and sometimes even reaching bone. In the United States, some states like Delaware continued judicial flogging into the 1950s, though these practices were rooted in laws written in the 1800s. Britain's Indian Penal Code, enacted in 1860, retained judicial whipping for over 50 offenses and applied it to local populations under colonial courts. The British Empire exported these punishment practices around the world, embedding them in legal systems from India to the Caribbean to Australia. The medical and mortality risks of these punishments were severe and well documented, yet legally accepted. Whippings often led to infected wounds. In an era before antibiotics, infection could easily turn to gangrene, and gangrene often meant death. Some people suffered spinal damage from particularly severe beatings. Pillory victims died from concussions when they were hit in the head with stones, from stabbings when crowd violence escalated, or simply from exposure if they were left locked in the pillory overnight in cold weather. And here's the thing, there was no legal liability for the state or for the crowds. If you died in the pillory because someone in the crowd stabbed you, that wasn't murder. It was just an unfortunate outcome of a lawful punishment. Parliamentary. Reports in the 1810s in England documented dozens of annual deaths from these punishments, yet courts deemed them acceptable risks of lawful justice. The system acknowledged people were dying and decided that was simply the price of maintaining order. Eventually, attitudes began to shift toward imprisonment critiques. Reformers like Jeremy Bentham argued that public punishments brutalized the crowds who watched them and failed to actually deter crime. Instead of being frightened into good behavior, crowds often became desensitized to violence or even enjoyed the spectacle. Bentham and others pushed the Whig government in the 1830s toward building penitentiaries, prisons designed to reform criminals through isolation and labor, rather than punishing them through public spectacles of pain. The 1828 Select Committee on Jails, which investigated prison conditions, criticized flogging's cruelty and questioned whether it served any useful purpose. This led to a series of acts in the 1860s that banned judicial whipping in England, except in military contexts and within prisons themselves. Finally, let's consider the enduring legacy and abolition timeline of these practices. The pillory ended in 1837 with a specific act of Parliament abolishing it. Public whipping was phased out in Britain by the 1870s, but the United States and British colonies lingered longer with these practices. They symbolize a transition in thinking about punishment from public spectacles of pain to what was considered more humane incarceration behind prison walls. These historical practices shaped modern debates about what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. In the United States, cases brought under the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, often reference the history of corporal punishment when determining what crosses the line. Globally, bans on torture and corporal punishment under human rights law today were developed partly in reaction to the knowledge of what governments used to do legally. The fact that we now consider these practices barbaric shows how much our understanding of justice and human dignity has evolved. But in the 1800s, all of this was lawful, ordinary, and considered necessary for maintaining social order. Rest easy. Let the weight of history settle as we prepare to continue our journey now. Segment 4. Extreme corporal punishment of workers and servants. Let's continue our journey in Dexler, how the law permitted employers to use extreme corporal punishment against their workers. This wasn't just about harsh working conditions. It was about a legal system that gave employers the right to physically beat the people who worked for them. To understand how this was possible, we need to start with the legal doctrine of master-servant relations. Under English common law, there was something called the master-servant doctrine. This was codified in statutes like the Master and Servant Act of 1823. These laws gave employers broad authority to physically correct workers for negligence, disobedience, or breach of contract. The law treated beating your workers as a form of correction, like disciplining a child. This was treated as a civil matter rather than a criminal one, meaning it was considered a private dispute between employer and employee, not something the criminal justice system should concern itself with. Courts rarely intervened unless beatings caused death or permanent disfigurement. As long as you didn't kill your worker or maim them for life, the courts viewed such discipline as a private right, similar to the way parents were allowed to physically punish their children. Your employee was, in a legal sense, under your authority in much the same way a child was under parental authority. This legal framework had a remarkable scope across free and unfree labor. It applied to apprentices who were learning trades. It applied to domestic servants who worked in people's homes. It applied to factory hands in the new industrial mills, to agricultural laborers working on farms, to sailors on ships, and to soldiers in the military. It even applied to enslaved or indentured workers in the colonies. Laws explicitly granted masters what they called reasonable chastisement powers. In Britain and the colonies, there were over 10,000 annual prosecutions under master-servant laws during the 1830s through 1850s. But here's the crucial detail. These prosecutions were almost always of workers, not employers. Workers were prosecuted for breaking contracts, for being absent, for being drunk, for talking back. The penalties were fines or short jail terms. Employers who used force against workers were essentially never prosecuted. The legal system was fundamentally designed to protect employers' authority over workers. Let's look at factory and industrial settings specifically. In textile mills and mines, overseers used belts, sticks, or straps to beat children and adults for slowing down production lines or for machinery faults that weren't even their responsibility. This was legally sanctioned by minimal factory acts. Until 1833, and even after that, the protections were limited. Parliamentary inquiries in the 1840s, official government investigations, documented routine floggings of child workers between the ages of 5 and 13 in Lancashire cotton mills. 5 years old. Children who should have been playing were instead working 14-hour days in factories, and if they slowed down or made mistakes, they were beaten. The factory owners faced no criminal charges for this. It was considered part of normal industrial discipline. The apprenticeship system was particularly prone to abuses. Pauper apprentices were often orphaned children or children from very poor families who were bound to a master until they reached age 21. They faced brutal whippings from their masters for minor infractions. Parish overseers, the local officials responsible for the poor, would contractually authorize such correction when they bound children as apprentices. In the early 1800s, workhouses legally apprenticed thousands of children to factories. These children were beaten regularly, sometimes severely. There are documented cases of injuries, broken bones, infected wounds. But when these cases went to court, the beatings were upheld as contractual discipline. The master had a contract that gave him the right to discipline his apprentice, and the courts enforced that contract even when the discipline caused serious harm. Domestic servant discipline operated similarly within households. The head of a household could lawfully strike maids, footmen, or governesses for being late, for breaking something, or for what was called impudence, essentially for talking back or showing insufficient respect. If a servant went to the police to complain about being beaten, the police would dismiss it as an internal family matter. Victorian conduct manuals, the etiquette guides that told people how to behave properly, actually endorsed moderate beatings of servants. Records from 19th century assize courts, the major criminal courts in England, show 0 successful prosecutions by servants against employers for assault before the reforms of the 1870s. Not one. Servants could be beaten in their workplace, which was also often their home, and they had no legal recourse whatsoever. In agricultural and rural settings, farmers whipped laborers or tied them to carts for public flogging over crop losses or suspicions of poaching. This was backed by local justices of the peace who enforced vagrancy laws and game laws. The game laws made it illegal for common people to hunt on land they didn't own, even if they were starving. If a farm worker was suspected of catching a rabbit to feed his family, he could be publicly flogged for it, and the local magistrate would uphold this punishment. In Ireland during the pre-famine period, from 1800 through the 1840s, landlords' agents beat tenant farmers legally under what were called customary tenure rules. These were traditional practices that had become embedded in the legal system. This violence contributed to the mass evictions that devastated Ireland, and there was essentially no legal challenge available to the tenants being beaten and evicted. We can see maritime and military parallels that institutionalized this violence. Even further, ship captains flogged sailors with the cat-o'-nine tails for drunkenness or mutiny. They could order up to 48 lashes, and this was codified in the Naval Discipline Act, which remained in force until 1866. In the British Army, regulations permitted non-commissioned officers to beat privates, the lowest-ranking soldiers. During the Napoleonic era, in the early 1800s, there were over 4,000 floggings annually in British military forces. The military believed this was essential to maintaining discipline. Soldiers and sailors were subjected to systematic violence as a routine part of their service. The situation reached its most extreme forms in colonial and plantation settings. In British India, Jamaica, and Australia, overseers whipped indentured laborers or colonized workers routinely. Colonial codes placed limits only on fatal blows. You couldn't beat someone to death, but anything short of that was generally permitted. Australia's convict system, which operated until the 1840s, mandated that employers who took on convict labor had the right to flog them. At the system's peak, records show over 50,000 lashes administered yearly. That's not 50,000 people receiving one lash each. That's 50,000 separate flogging incidents, often involving dozens of lashes per person. The scale of this violence is difficult to comprehend. The physical and psychological toll of all this violence was enormous. Beatings caused lacerations that would tear open the skin, fractures that would break bones, infections that could turn deadly in an era before antibiotics. There are documented cases of workers committing suicide to escape the constant violence and degradation. Medical testimony in trials confirmed permanent scarring, doctors describing backs that looked like raw meat from repeated whippings. Yet this testimony rarely swayed judges. Survivor accounts from commissions in the 1840s, when the government finally started investigating these conditions more seriously, described chronic pain and trauma that lasted for years. But victim testimony was legally discounted as biased. The courts reasoned that workers would naturally exaggerate their suffering to get compensation or to get their employers in trouble, so their testimony couldn't be trusted. Eventually, pressure began to build for legal restriction of these practices. Trade unions, which were finally becoming legal and powerful enough to advocate for workers, and social reformers pushed for change. The Conspiracy and Protection of Property Act of 1875 finally criminalized employer violence in Britain. This was a landmark shift. For the first time, it became a crime for an employer to beat a worker. United States followed, with various states passing similar laws by around 1900. This marked the shift from private correction, where beating workers was seen as a private matter between employer and employee, to assault charges where beating someone was recognized as a crime regardless of the employment relationship. However, enforcement lagged significantly. Just because there was a law on the books didn't mean police and prosecutors vigorously enforced it. It wasn't until 20th century labor laws created stronger protections and enforcement mechanisms that workers gained real protection from employer violence. What we're seeing in all of this is how the legal system reinforced economic and social hierarchies. Employers had authority over workers that extended to their physical bodies. This wasn't some medieval relic. This was the legal framework during the Industrial Revolution, during the height of the British Empire, during a period when Western nations considered themselves the most advanced and civilized societies in human history. Yet their laws permitted systematic violence against working people, including children, and provided essentially no recourse for victims. The law protected property and authority, not workers' bodies or dignity. Segment 5. Lethally dangerous working conditions in mines and factories. In this segment, we'll look at the lethally dangerous working conditions in mines and factories during the Industrial Revolution. These weren't just difficult or unpleasant jobs. These were workplaces where death and maiming were routine, expected, and entirely legal. Let's begin with the explosive growth of unregulated industry. The Industrial Revolution transformed Britain and then spread across Europe and North America. Factories and mines expanded rapidly from 1800 to 1850, and the driving force was output, production, profit. Safety was simply not a consideration. British law imposed almost no equipment or ventilation standards until very late in the century. Coal production tripled in Britain alone between 1800 and 1830. This was driven by digging deeper and deeper shafts into the earth and by using steam engines that could pump water out of mines and lift coal to the surface. These technological advances amplified the risks without any corresponding safeguards. There were no regulations about how deep you could dig, how you should support the tunnels, how you should ventilate them, or what safety equipment workers should have. The attitude was essentially that business owners should be free to run their operations however they saw fit. This brings us to coal mine disasters from fire damp explosions. Deep in coal mines, methane gas accumulated. Miners called it fire damp. This gas is highly explosive when it mixes with air in the right proportions. Miners worked by the light of naked flames, candles, or oil lamps, and any spark could ignite the fire damp, causing massive explosions. There was a safety lamp invented by Sir Humphrey Davy in 1815, a Davy lamp which was designed to burn without igniting the surrounding gas. But mine owners used these lamps inconsistently, if they used them at all. They were expensive, and they gave less light than open flames, which meant workers were slower. In 1835, the Wallsend colliery explosion in England killed 102 people, mostly boys under the age of 18. The inquest, the official inquiry into the deaths, ruled it an unavoidable act of God, not negligence, not the owner's fault, not anyone's fault, just one of those things that happens. This was the standard legal response to mine disasters. Even without explosions, mines were deadly due to roof collapses and flooding hazards. Timber supports were used to hold up the roof of mine tunnels, but timber was expensive, so mine owners used as little as possible. This led to frequent cave-ins. Workers would be buried alive under tons of rock and earth. Mines also frequently flooded. Pumps were supposed to keep the water out, but they failed regularly, and when they did, workers could be trapped underground in rising water for days before they drowned or before rescuers could reach them. In 1844, British mines saw over 200 deaths from collapses annually. That's just collapse deaths, not counting explosions, flooding, or other causes. Ventilation shafts, which were supposed to provide fresh air and emergency exits, were often too narrow for an adult to climb through. All of this was perfectly legal under property rights. The mine owner owned the property, and the government took the position that owners should be free to manage their property as they wished. Factory machinery without guards created different but equally deadly hazards. Steam-powered looms, rollers, and belts had no barriers around them. Children and women operated this machinery during 14-hour shifts. If you got tired, if your attention wandered for a moment, if you slipped, the machinery could catch your clothing or your hair and pull you in. Limbs were mangled. Arms and legs were torn off. People were crushed. One of the routine tasks was cleaning the moving parts of machines, and workers were expected to do this while the machines were still running, because stopping the machines meant losing production time. By the 1840s, Lancashire cotton mills alone reported over 1,000 amputations yearly. 1,000 people losing arms, legs, hands, or feet every single year in just one region of England. These were classified as workplace accidents, unavoidable incidents. Not a single owner was prosecuted for these injuries. Beyond the immediate physical dangers, there were toxic exposures that caused slower but equally certain death. Coal dust and silica-filled unventilated mines, and breathing this dust day after day, year after year, caused a disease called pneumoconiosis, which miners called black lung. Your lungs would gradually fill with dust until you couldn't breathe properly anymore. In factories, workers were exposed to dangerous chemicals. Matchmaking factories used white phosphorus, which caused a condition called phossy jaw. The phosphorus fumes would rot away the workers' jawbones. Miners would cough up black phlegm for decades after they stopped working underground. Their lungs were destroyed. But the medical links between these exposures and disease were dismissed until the 1890s. Doctors and courts argued that you couldn't prove the connection, that maybe these workers were just naturally sickly. This left owners completely unaccountable for the poisoning of their workforce. Child and female worker vulnerability made all of these dangers even worse. Children as young as 5 years old worked in mines and factories. In mines, children crawled through low seams, narrow tunnels where adults couldn't fit, to push carts of coal or to open and close ventilation doors. In factories, children crawled under running machines to clean them or to pick up dropped items. Women in some coal mines hauled coal tubs, heavy containers of coal, and in some pits they worked naked above the waist because of the heat and the cramped conditions. This amplified injury rates because they had no protection. The 1842 UK Mines Act reports, official government documents, documented girls aged 8 being beaten for slowing down in hazardous drifts, dangerous sections of mines. This was fully legal employer practice. As we discussed in the previous segment, let's look at the statistical death tolls before regulation. Britain alone lost between 1,000 and 2,000 miners yearly to accidents during the 1840s through 1860s. Every year, thousands of dead miners. The United States anthracite regions, where hard coal was mined in Pennsylvania and neighboring states, saw similar death rates per ton of coal mined. Factory inspectors, when they finally started keeping records, noted that 20 to 30% of all workforce injuries resulted in permanent disability. A quarter to a third of injured workers remained for life. Yet coroners' juries, the bodies responsible for determining cause of death, consistently returned verdicts of accidental death. No one was at fault. These were just unfortunate accidents that happened in the natural course of business. There was also a complete absence of compensation or liability for these deaths and injuries. No workers' compensation existed. If you were injured and couldn't work, you received nothing from your employer. If you were killed, your family received nothing. They might get charity from the church or parish aid from local poor relief, but that was minimal. In fact, owners would often deduct funeral costs from wages owed to the deceased worker's family. The family had to pay to bury their father or mother or child who had been killed at work. Courts upheld contracts that explicitly waived employer responsibility for injuries. There was a case in 1837, R.V. Nixon, where a factory owner's negligence killed 50 people. 50 deaths from a single incident of negligence. He faced no criminal charges. None. The law simply didn't recognize this as a crime. Eventually, government inquiries began to expose these horrors to the broader public. The 1842 Children's Employment Commission investigated conditions in mines and revealed them as death traps. The commission included graphic illustrations showing children working in impossible conditions, crawling through tunnels barely wider than their bodies, dragging heavy loads. These illustrations shocked Parliament and the public, but the result was only partial bans. The 1842 Mines Act prohibited boys under 10 and all women and girls from working underground in coal mines. That was it. Boys of 10 and older could still work there. The factory's inquiry of 1833 cataloged children with mangled limbs, children with stunted growth from malnutrition and overwork, children who were dead by their teenage years. This prompted the 1833 Factory Act, which limited children under 9 to 9-hour workdays. Think about that. The reform, the great improvement, was that 8-year-olds could only be forced to work 9 hours a day instead of 14. And even this minimal act included no safety mandates, no requirements. For machine guards, no requirements for ventilation. There was a gradual shift via unions and laws, but it was painfully slow. The peak dangers didn't begin to decline until after the 1870s, and that was due to pressure from groups like the miners' unions, which had finally gained enough power to demand changes. The 1872 Metalliferous Mines Act required inspections of metal mines. Government inspectors could now visit mines and cite violations. But even this law didn't establish criminal negligence as a concept. An owner could be fined for violations, but killing workers through negligence still wasn't treated as a serious crime. The legacy of all this suffering is that modern manslaughter laws that allow us to prosecute people for causing death through negligence, trace back to these exposes. It took decades of horror, thousands upon thousands of deaths, before the law began to reframe accidents as potentially prosecutable crimes. Before that shift, an employer could create conditions that were virtually certain to kill workers. And as long as he didn't intentionally murder someone, he faced no criminal liability whatsoever. What we're seeing here is how the law prioritized economic development and property rights over human life. The workers who died in mines and factories were the fuel for the Industrial Revolution, as surely as coal was the fuel for the steam engines. They were consumed, used up, and discarded, and all of it was legal. All of it was within the rights of property owners and business operators. The law protected the people who owned the mines and factories, not the people who worked in them and died in them. Breathe slowly. Let yourself relax. These were dark chapters in human history, but understanding them helps us appreciate the protections we have today and reminds us to remain vigilant. Segment 6. Industrial Child Labor. Let's continue our journey in and focus specifically on industrial child labor. We've touched on this in previous segments, but now we'll explore it in depth. This was a system where childhood, as we understand it, essentially didn't exist for poor families, and where the law not only permitted but actively facilitated the exploitation of children. We begin with the explosive demand in early factories. The textile boom from 1800 to 1830 created what seemed like an insatiable need for cheap labor. Factory owners found their answer in children from workhouses and poor families. These children were brought into mills and legally classified as apprentices or family helpers, terms that made the arrangement sound educational or familial rather than exploitative. In Britain, by 1830, over 20% of all factory workers were under the age of 15. 1 in 5 workers was a child. There were laws on the books, like the 1802 Health and Morals of Apprentices Act, but this law offered only voluntary guidelines. It suggested that factory owners should perhaps not work children quite so hard, should perhaps provide them with some education. But these were suggestions, not requirements, and owners simply ignored them. There were no inspectors, no enforcement mechanisms, no penalties for violation. Let's talk about ages and recruitment pipelines. Children started factory work at 4 to 6 years old. 4 years old, barely past toddlerhood. Many of these children were what were called parish apprentices, children who had been orphaned or whose families were so poor they couldn't care for them. The parish, the local government unit responsible for poor relief, would bind these children as apprentices until they turned 21. They received no pay beyond basic food and shelter, and often the food was inadequate and the shelter was just a space in a crowded dormitory. Workhouses, institutions where the poor were sent, legally auctioned off thousands of children yearly to factory masters. This severed family ties completely. Even if a child had parents or siblings, once they were apprenticed out, they might never see their family again. The system treated children as disposable commodities, as units of labor to be bought, sold, and used up. The shift lengths and sleep deprivation these children endured were brutal. 12 to 16-hour days, 6 days a week. The workday began at 5 in the morning, summoned by factory bells. There were no breaks except for meals, and even meals were eaten at the machines because stopping production meant losing money. This led to chronic exhaustion. Children would fall asleep standing up. They would stumble around in a daze. French. Laws from 1841 actually permitted children between 8 and 12 years old to work 10-hour shifts. That was considered a reform, a progressive law. Britain's 1833 Factory Act capped children under 9 at 9 hours per day. Again, this was considered an improvement, but even these minimal protections lacked enforcement. There were too few inspectors, and factory owners could easily hide violations when inspectors did visit. Textile mills presented specific, horrifying hazards for child workers. Children crawled under power looms, massive mechanical weaving machines, to tie broken threads while the machines were still running. If they were too slow, if they misjudged the timing, they could be scalped or crushed. The air in textile mills was kept deliberately humid to prevent threads from breaking, and this humid environment was a breeding ground for tuberculosis and other respiratory diseases. Mill fever was a common term for the infections that swept through factories, felling children by the dozens. Lancashire reports from the 1840s tallied dozens of child deaths yearly for machinery accidents alone. Yet owners faced no liability. When a child died, another child took their place at the machine. The system just continued. Mine work for the youngest children was somehow even worse. The youngest mine workers were called trappers' children, aged 5 to 8, who sat alone in the dark depths of coal mines. Their job was to open and close ventilation doors when coal carts passed through. Imagine being 6 years old, sitting in complete darkness hundreds of feet underground for 12 hours at a time, waiting to hear the sound of an approaching cart so you could open a door. Other children, often girls, worked as hurriers. They hauled coal tubs on all fours with chains around their waists, like beasts of burden. The 1842 UK Mines Report, a government investigation, exposed 8-year-old children working 12 hours underground in these conditions. All of it was fully legal before regulation. The report included testimonies from children describing their work, and illustrations showing children crawling through tunnels barely wider than their bodies, dragging loads of coal behind them. The physical deformities and injuries that resulted from this work were predictable and widespread. Children suffered stunted growth from malnutrition. They weren't fed enough to support the physical demands being placed on them, so their bodies simply didn't grow properly. They developed bowed legs from hauling heavy tubs in crouched positions. They experienced lung collapse from breathing coal dust and textile fibers. Medical examinations showed that factory children were often half the height of children from better-off families of the same age. In phosphorus match factories, where matches were made using white phosphorus, girls as young as 9 developed phossy jaw, a condition where the phosphorus fumes caused their jawbones to rot and die. Their faces would literally decay. This was dismissed as an occupational risk, just part of the job, not something that needed to be prevented or compensated. Disciplinary beatings were integrated into the system of child labor. Overseers, the supervisors who managed factory floors, whipped children who worked too slowly. They used straps, belts, sticks, whatever was at hand. This was legal under master-servant laws, which we discussed in an earlier segment. Children testified to daily violence in the 1831 to 1832 Sadler Committee hearings, official parliamentary investigations into factory conditions. They described being beaten for yawning, for sitting down, for crying, for failing to meet impossible production quotas. And there was no recourse. If a child complained to authorities, or if their parents tried to intervene, the result was dismissal from the factory, which meant the family lost crucial income, or the parish might retaliate against the family, reducing their poor relief or threatening to separate them further. These children also had zero education or playtime. Schooling was completely absent from their lives. Some attended Sunday schools, but these just taught basic reading through religious instruction, and most children were too exhausted to learn anything. They would fall asleep during lessons. There was one notable exception: Robert Owen's new Lanark experiment in Scotland in the early 1800s. Owen was a factory owner who proved that if you gave children shorter working hours and provided them with education, they actually developed better, and the factory could still be profitable. But his was a rare voluntary outlier. Other factory owners saw no reason to follow his example. They could make more money by working children harder, so that's what they did. Why did parents allow this? We need to understand the family economic desperation that drove this system. Parents sent their children to work, because the alternative was starvation. A child might earn 2 shillings weekly at most, a tiny sum. But for desperately poor families, it could mean the difference between eating and not eating. Laws reinforced this by criminalizing idle parents, parents who didn't make their children work. If you were poor and you weren't finding work for your children, you could be prosecuted for raising idle children who might become a burden on the parish. The 1840s Blue Books, government reports on social conditions, documented mothers, saying they preferred sending their children to work in mills over watching them starve. It wasn't a choice made lightly. It was a choice made under impossible circumstances, where every option was terrible, and you picked the one that seemed like it might let your family survive. Eventually, there was reform momentum, though it came with significant limits. Michael Sadler led a campaign in 1832 that brought national attention to child labor. The 1842 Mines Act banned children under 10 from working in coal pits and prohibited all women and girls from underground work. But loopholes persisted. The law applied only to coal mines, not other types of mines. It didn't apply to surface work at mines. Enforcement was minimal. It wasn't until 1878 that more comprehensive regulations closed some of these loopholes. France passed a similar law in 1874, but it was equally weak in enforcement. Trade unions and exposes in newspapers and government reports gradually shifted public opinion and social norms. This paved the way for 20th century bans on child labor. But millions of children endured these conditions legally well into the 1890s. Generations of children had their childhood stolen, their health destroyed, their potential crushed, all within the bounds of the law. What we see in industrial child labor is perhaps the clearest example of how legal doesn't mean moral or right. Every society that permitted this looked back on it with shame once it ended. But at the time, it was defended as necessary for economic progress, as helping poor families, as teaching children the value of work. The law protected the factory, owners who profited from children's labor, not the children themselves. It took decades of activism, investigation, and political pressure to change these laws. And even then, change came slowly and incompletely. Segment 7. Pauper Apprenticeship and Forced Child Servitude. Let's continue our exploration of the 1800s. In this segment, we'll look at a specific system of child exploitation called pauper apprenticeship. This was a formalized legal mechanism that took poor children, separated them from their families, and bound them into what was essentially forced servitude, all under the guise of teaching them a trade. To understand this system, we need to look at its origins in the poor law system. The 1601 Poor Law was an English statute that created a framework for dealing with poverty. Part of that framework gave parish overseers, local officials responsible for the poor, the authority to auction off pauper children as apprentices to masters who would supposedly teach them a trade. This practice peaked during the Industrial Revolution, from the 1780s through the 1830s, when factories had an insatiable demand for cheap labor. By 1800, over 10,000 children annually were being bound through this system. The law legally severed parental rights without any court oversight. If your family was poor and receiving parish relief, the overseers could simply take your children and give them to someone else, and you had no legal recourse to stop it. The legal binding happened without the child's consent or meaningful family. Input: children as young as 4 to 7 years old would have apprenticeship indentures signed on their behalf. The child couldn't read the contract, couldn't understand what was happening. Parish overseers would make a mark for the child, and that was legally binding. These contracts committed children until they reached age 21 or 24, depending on whether they were boys or girls. Girls were often bound for longer periods. The child had no veto power. The family had no veto power. These contracts treated children as chattels, as property. If a child tried to breach the contract by running away, they could be charged with vagrancy and re-auctioned to another master, possibly one even worse dot under these apprenticeships. Children received zero wages and only minimal provisions. They were given food, lodging, and clothes, but these were often rotten or insufficient. The food might be moldy bread and thin gruel. The lodging might be a spot on a dirty floor in a crowded room. The clothes might be rags. This made escape economically impossible. Where would a child go? They had no money, no resources, no one to turn to. Masters would deduct the cost of keeping the child, housing and feeding them from hypothetical future wages. This was a legal fiction that ensured perpetual debt servitude. The child supposedly owed the master for the cost of their own survival. So even when they reached the age where the apprenticeship should end, they were told they owed money and had to keep working to pay it off. The system involved mass shipment of children to industrial factories, particularly in the north of England. London parishes and rural parishes sent over 12,000 children to northern cotton mills in places like Lytton Mill in Derbyshire. These children traveled 200 miles or more on foot or in wagons. In 1819, Robert Owen, the factory reformer we mentioned earlier, gave testimony describing 500 children arriving at a mill, starved and exhausted after their journey. They were handed over legally for what were essentially life terms. They would work in these mills until they were adults, if they survived that long. The cotton mills where these children ended up were hellholes. In Lancashire mills, pauper apprentices worked 13 to 15-hour days. Their job was often piecing threads, tying together broken threads under the looms while the machines were running. At night, they were locked inside the mills to prevent them from running away. They slept in shifts in the same beds, what was called hot bedding, where one child would get up to work and another would take their warm spot in the bed. They were beaten for showing fatigue, for working too slowly, for making mistakes. Factory Commission investigations of 1818 to 1819 found that 75% of workers under age 14 in these mills were parish children, pauper apprentices. The mortality rates hit 25% yearly. 1 in 4 of these children died every year from exhaustion, disease, accidents, and abuse. And this was all perfectly legal. The system wasn't limited to factories. There was also agricultural and colonial export of these children. Rural masters bound children to work on farms for plowing and herding. Other children were shipped even further away to Canadian and Australian colonies as part of what became known as the Home Children Movement. These children were sent to work for colonial settlers. Britain's 1838 Poor Law Amendment Act facilitated sending over 100,000 children to empire outposts over the following decades. These children were legally auctioned at ports when they arrived, sold to whoever wanted labor. Their families back in England often received no notification about where their children had been sent. A child could be taken from London and end up in rural Australia with no way to ever contact their parents again. Routine violence and discipline were built into the apprenticeship system. Masters could whip children with straps or confine them in what were called dark holes, small spaces where children were locked in darkness as punishment. This was upheld under master-servant laws as contractual correction. The master had a contract that gave him authority over the child, and physical punishment was considered a legitimate exercise of that authority. Survivor memoirs from exposes, published in the 1840s, detailed branding and starvation punishments. Some masters would brand their apprentices like cattle to mark them as property. Others would deliberately withhold food as punishment. These practices were unchallenged in magistrates' courts. When cases did come before local judges, the magistrates almost always sided with the masters. The health devastation among pauper apprentices was predictable and widespread. Children developed rickets from working in darkness and not getting sunlight, which is necessary for bone development. They contracted tuberculosis from damp mills with poor ventilation. Some committed suicide out of desperation. Statistical analyses showed that apprentices died at 5 times the rate of free children of the same age. Children who tried to escape faced recapture under vagrancy acts, laws that made it illegal to be poor and wandering without a master or employer. The Sadler Committee hearings in 1831 heard testimony about 10-year-old children being flogged to death legally. A child would be beaten so severely that they died from their injuries, and no crime had been committed under the law. There were supposed to be oversight mechanisms, but they suffered from failures and cover-ups. Parish overseers were supposed to visit apprentices to check on their welfare, but these visits were rare, maybe once a year if the child was lucky. Many overseers were corrupt and colluded with masters, falsifying health reports to evade scrutiny. The masters would sometimes pay off the overseers to report that everything was fine. The 1834 Poor Law Commission, which reformed the system of poor relief, essentially ignored these abuses. The Commission's priority was reducing the cost of supporting the poor and shipping children off to work for no wages in distant factories. Accomplished that goal. Child welfare was not a concern. Finally, there was abolition of the system via reform pressure, though it took decades. The 1833 Factory Act banned pauper apprentices under age 9 from factories. That still meant 9-year-olds could be sent to mills, but it was a start. The 1844 Mines Act excluded pauper apprentices from working in coal pits. The system gradually ended by the 1870s, largely due to exposes published by reformers and pressure from newly forming trade unions. The legacy of pauper apprenticeship is significant. It became a model for modern child trafficking laws. Today, we recognize coerced child labor as a crime, as a form of human trafficking. But that recognition came directly from looking back at systems like pauper apprenticeship and saying, never again. We looked at what was once legal and decided it was so morally wrong that we needed laws, specifically to prevent anything like it from happening again. What we see in pauper apprenticeship is the intersection of poverty, industrialization, and legal authority, creating a system of child exploitation that operated in plain sight. These weren't secret abuses hidden from the authorities. This was the official system for dealing with poor children. Lawmakers and parish officials believed they were being practical and efficient. Children were being put to productive use, and the parish saved money by not having to support them. The human cost, the stolen childhoods, the broken bodies, the deaths, all of that was considered an acceptable trade-off. The law facilitated this system, protected it, and punished anyone who tried to escape it. Segment 8. Legal domestic violence against wives. In this segment, we'll examine how the law treated violence against wives in the 1800s. This is a difficult topic, but it's important to understand how legal systems not only failed to protect women from domestic violence, but actually permitted and justified it. Let's begin with the coverture doctrine's legal foundation. Under English common law, which was inherited in the United States and British colonies, there was a legal principle called coverture. This doctrine held that when a woman married, her legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. Husband and wife became one legal entity, and the husband was in control of that entity. This wasn't just a metaphor. It had real legal consequences. A married woman couldn't own property in her own name, couldn't sign contracts, couldn't sue or be sued. And coverture also justified what was called moderate correction, the husband's supposed prerogative to physically discipline his wife to maintain household order. Judges like Sir Matthew Halley in the 17th century explicitly endorsed this chastisement, and his writings were still being cited in the 1800s as legal authority. There's a persistent myth about something called the rule of thumb, the idea that a husband could beat his wife with a stick as long as it was no thicker than his thumb. While that specific formulation is likely a folk etymology rather than actual law, the concept behind it, that there were limits on how severely you could beat your wife, but that beating her was fundamentally permissible, was very real in legal doctrine. So, what was the scope of permitted violence? Husbands could lawfully strike, whip, or confine their wives for what was considered misbehavior. This included nagging, disobedience, spending money the husband didn't approve of, or really anything the husband decided was problematic. The legal test was essentially whether the violence caused broken bones, permanent scars, or life-threatening injuries. As long as you stayed below that threshold, you were within your rights as a husband. Blackstone's commentaries, written between 1765 and 1769, were hugely influential legal texts that continued to be cited throughout the 1800s. Blackstone explicitly analogized a husband's right to beat his wife to parental rights over children, just as parents could physically discipline children too. Correct their behavior, husbands could physically discipline wives. The law framed these beatings as domestic discipline, as a reasonable exercise of household authority. This principle was reinforced through patriarchal authority embedded in statutes. Master-servant laws, which we've discussed in earlier segments, extended to wives. The Master and Servant Act of 1823 reinforced what it called correction rights for employers, and courts interpreted husbands as having similar authority over wives. When women went to the police to complain about being beaten, police treated these complaints as private quarrels unless neighbors intervened or the injuries were extremely severe. Victorian conduct books, etiquette guides that told people how to behave, and sermons from clergy routinely advised that moderate chastisement was acceptable to enforce wifely submission. Women were told from pulpits and in popular literature that they should submit to their husbands, that occasional physical correction was part of marriage, that a good wife would accept this as normal. The prevalence of wife beating crossed all social classes. In working-class communities, it was epidemic. Magistrates' courts, the lower criminal courts, heard hundreds of cases weekly. Middle-class cases were often hushed up to avoid scandal, but newspaper accounts and divorce petitions show they were common as well. The Times newspaper wrote in 1846 that wife-beating was a national blot on England, noting that there was particular leniency for what was called rough usage among the poor. The implication was that working-class men were naturally rougher, more violent, and that beatings in that context weren't quite as serious as they would be among the genteel middle class. Police and judicial non-intervention was the norm. Constables, the police officers of the time, rarely arrested a husband unless the wife had extremely severe injuries. If a case did make it to court, the typical outcome was that the husband would be bound over, keep the peace. This meant he would pay a small fine, maybe £1 to £5, or serve a short jail sentence of 1 to 2 months. Often the fine was paid using money from the household budget, which meant the wife was essentially paying the penalty for her own beating. There's testimony from the 1840s where a beaten wife said, "Why shouldn't I stand a lick now and then, if he fancies it?" This reflected how normalized and tolerated this violence was. Women were socialized to accept it as just part of married life. There were significant risks for wives seeking redress through the legal system. Filing a complaint could invite retaliation. A husband might beat his wife even more severely for daring to report him. He might evict her from the home, which was legally his property. He might take away her children because he had legal custody of them. Many women withdrew charges under coercion, as parliamentary debates at the time noted. Defense attorneys, representing accused husbands, would argue that the wife had provoked the violence by being a termagant, a nagging, difficult woman. This argument often swayed juries toward leniency, even in cases where the beating had been severe. If a husband killed his wife, juries would often reduce the charge from murder to manslaughter. If they believed the wife had been difficult or provocative, fatal cases were disturbingly common, and manslaughter became the standard charge rather than murder. Hundreds of women died yearly from beatings by their husbands, but convictions were rare. When convictions did occur, juries would often acquit entirely or reduce murder charges to manslaughter, which carried sentences of only 3 to 12 years. The press criticized these light penalties. Newspapers would report on cases where a man received only 12 months in prison for nearly killing his wife, and editorial writers would point out that this encouraged impunity. Men could beat their wives with little fear of serious consequences, and everyone knew it. There were also class and racial dimensions to how this violence was perceived and prosecuted. Upper-class society viewed wife-beating as barbaric, but considered it a normal part of lower-class life. Colonial laws amplified these principles for enslaved or indigenous wives under the authority of plantation owners. In the United States, states like Mississippi codified moderate correction explicitly in their laws until after the Civil War. The legal framework that permitted husbands to beat wives was extended and intensified in colonial contexts, where racial hierarchies combined with gender hierarchies to leave women of color with even fewer protections. Eventually, there was feminist and reform agitation that began to challenge these norms. The 1853 Aggravated Assaults Act raised penalties for severe cases to a £20 fine or 6 months of hard labor. Magistrates nicknamed this the Women's Protection Act because it was one of the first laws that specifically addressed violence against women. A member of Parliament named Henry Fitzroy highlighted the coaxings and intimidations that pressured wives to drop cases. Reformers were beginning to document and publicize the structural problems with how the legal system handled domestic violence. Women's rights advocates argued that wives needed independent legal standing and that violence within marriage should be treated as seriously as violence between strangers. The path to criminalization was gradual and incomplete. The 1878 Matrimonial Causes Amendment Act allowed wives to seek legal separation after an assault conviction and gave them rights to child custody and financial maintenance. This was significant because it meant a woman could leave an abusive marriage and have some legal support. The Married Women's Property Acts of the 1870s and 1890s enabled women to own property and have some economic independence, which made it more feasible to leave an abusive husband. By the end of the century, the legal threshold for what counted as reasonable chastisement had lowered. Courts were beginning to treat any significant violence as assault rather than as a husband's legal right. This shift laid the groundwork for modern domestic violence laws. Though real enforcement and protection mechanisms took well into the 20th century to develop, what we see in the history of legal domestic violence is how deeply gender inequality was embedded in the law. The legal system didn't just fail to protect women, it actively legitimized violence against them. Coverture treated women as legal dependents, as extensions of their husbands, rather than as independent persons. This legal framework meant that a husband beating his wife wasn't doing anything wrong in the eyes of the law as long as he didn't go too far. And too far was defined very loosely. Women had almost no recourse, no protection, no escape. The law that was supposed to provide justice instead trapped them in situations of ongoing violence and gave their abusers legal cover. Rest now. Breathe deeply. These are heavy truths, but understanding them helps us appreciate how far we've come and how important it is to continue protecting the vulnerable. Segment 9. Marital Rape. Let's continue our journey through the legal landscape of the 1800s. In this segment, we'll discuss one of the most disturbing aspects of coverture and marriage law: marital rape. This is difficult subject matter, but it's crucial to understand how the law treated women's bodily autonomy within marriage. We begin with coverture's fusion of identities, which we touched on in the previous segment. Under English common law, codified in Blackstone's commentaries, written between 1765 and 1769, marriage legally merged the wife's existence into her husband's. A woman lost her separate legal personhood when she married. This wasn't just about property or contracts. It extended to her body and her physical autonomy. This doctrine was carried to United States states and British colonies around the world. The legal theory held that a wife could not consent or withhold consent independently from her husband. Since she had no separate legal existence, she had no separate will. This made sexual relations within marriage non-negotiable. A husband had a legal right to his wife's body, and she had no legal right to refuse him. This was formalized through the doctrine of implied perpetual consent. Sir Matthew Hawley, a judge in the 1670s, declared that marriage constituted a blanket consent to intercourse at any time. According to Hale's interpretation, when a woman said "I do" at her wedding, she was giving consent to all future sexual acts with her husband, and that consent could only be revoked through divorce. But divorce was practically unattainable for most women in the 1800s. It required an act of Parliament in England until 1857, and even after that, it was expensive, scandalous, and available only on very limited grounds. In the United States, divorce laws varied by state, but everywhere it was difficult and carried enormous social stigma. Hale's words continued to influence legal rulings throughout the 1800s. In 1857, the case of Regina v. Clarence in Britain explicitly affirmed that rape was not possible within marriage. The courts declared that once vows were exchanged, a husband could not rape his wife as a matter of law. When we look at 19th century penal codes, we see an absence of marital rape from criminal statutes. Most criminal codes didn't explicitly create a marital exemption for rape because they didn't need to. Courts simply interpreted common law to exclude husbands from rape prosecutions. In United States states like New York, at least until 1895, and in England throughout the century, forced sex within marriage was treated as legal marital relations, not as a crime. When women tried to file complaints with prosecutors, their complaints were dismissed outright. Authorities viewed these as civil family disputes, private matters between husband and wife, not criminal matters for the courts to address. The scope of what was legally permitted covered all severity levels of sexual violence. Forced sexual acts ranged from routine coercion, where a husband would pressure or intimidate his wife into compliance, to violent penetration that caused physical injury. All of this was lawful as long as it didn't breach the limits of reasonable. Chastisement, which as we discussed in the previous segment, meant not causing life-threatening harm. Diaries from the period and court records that mention these issues in passing show wives enduring pain and injury without any legal recourse. This was normalized as wifely duty. Women were taught that submitting to their husband's sexual demands, regardless of their own wishes or physical condition, was part of their obligation as wives. We can see judicial endorsements of this principle throughout case law. In 1871, in the United States case State v. Rhodes in North Carolina, courts upheld a husband's right to chastise his wife through force, and this was explicitly extended to include sexual demands. Similar decisions in British assize courts equated a wife's refusal of sex with marital rebellion, a form of disobedience that the husband had a right to correct. When cases did come to trial where a husband was accused of assault in the context of forced sex, juries would acquit, citing the legal principle of consent by marriage. The assumption was that the wife had already consented by virtue of being married, so no assault had occurred. There was a clear link to domestic violence tolerance that we discussed in the previous segment. Marital rape often accompanied physical beatings. A husband who beat his wife would also force himself on her sexually, and courts refused to grant legal separation unless the violence was extreme. The 1857 Divorce Act in England, which made divorce slightly more accessible, required proof of cruelty beyond sexual force. Simply being forced to have sex with your husband didn't count as cruelty under the law. Police logs from 1840s London show that when women came to police stations with what they called wife ravishment pleas, complaints about being raped by their husbands, police would redirect them to ecclesiastical courts, church courts that handled some marriage matters. But these courts were powerless when it came to sexual matters within marriage. They had no authority to prosecute or punish, and often their advice was simply that women should be more obedient wives. class, and racial. Disparities shaped how these issues were handled. Middle-class cases stayed private through arbitration, or were simply never discussed publicly because of the scandal. Working-class wives who complained faced public shaming. They were accused of being bad wives, of failing in their marital duties, of airing private matters inappropriately. Enslaved women, both in the United States before abolition and in other systems of slavery around the world, had no marital rights at all. They were subjected to owners' sexual demands legally, and even if they had marriages recognized within. Enslaved communities, those marriages had no legal protection. Colonial laws in India, Australia, and other parts of the British Empire mirrored these exemptions under British legal codes. The principle that a husband could not rape his wife was exported around the world as part of colonial legal systems. The medical and health consequences of marital rape were entirely ignored by the legal system. Women suffered injuries like vaginal, tears, infections, and psychological trauma, but these were not treated as criminal matters. Victorian doctors, when consulted, often advised endurance for the sake of conjugal harmony. Women were told that maintaining peace in the marriage was more important than their own physical well-being. Postpartum rapes were particularly common and particularly damaging. Women who had just given birth and whose bodies were still healing would be forced into sexual relations by their husbands. This exacerbated maternal mortality and morbidity, but there was no legal intervention. A woman's health, even her life, was considered less important than a husband's sexual rights. Eventually, feminist critiques began to gain traction, though change was slow. The 1848 Seneca Falls Declaration in the United States, one of the founding documents of the women's rights movement, condemned coverture and its abuses, including around sexuality. Frances Power Cobb, a British feminist activist, ran an anti-violence campaign in 1878 that highlighted marital rape indirectly. She couldn't speak about it explicitly because the topic was considered too scandalous for public discussion, but she spoke about women's lack of bodily autonomy within marriage in ways that made the issue clear. Parliamentary debates in the 1890s began to question Hale's precedent, the 200-year-old legal doctrine that marriage meant perpetual consent. This was largely due to pressure from suffragists and women's rights activists who were demanding that women be treated as full legal persons. The seeds of 20th century criminalization were planted in the late 1800s, but they took a long time to grow. Canada struck down the marital rape exemption in 1889 through a judicial ruling, becoming one of the first jurisdictions to recognize that a husband could be guilty of raping his wife. Britain's 1922 Criminal Law Amendment Act chipped away at the exemption indirectly, though it didn't fully abolish it. In the United States, states didn't begin serious reforms until the 1970s. As part of the second wave feminist movement, the last state to criminalize marital rape was North Carolina, which didn't fully do so until 1993. Think about that. Until 1993, there were still places in the United States where a husband had a legal right to force sex on his wife. The legacy of these laws is that they exposed how deeply gender hierarchy was embedded in legal systems. The law didn't just fail to protect women from sexual violence within marriage. It actively legitimized that violence by declaring it wasn't violence at all, that it was simply the exercise of marital rights. This paved the way for modern consent-based statutes that recognize that consent must be ongoing and can be withdrawn at any time. that marriage doesn't constitute blanket permission for sexual access, and that everyone has a right to bodily autonomy, regardless of their relationship status. But for the entire 19th century, and much of the 20th, the law said otherwise. What we're seeing here is perhaps the most intimate and invasive way that coverture stripped women of their personhood. It wasn't just about property or money or the right to sign contracts. It was about control over women's very bodies in the most private and vulnerable moments. The law gave husbands absolute power and gave wives no protection, no recourse, no voice. And when women tried to speak up, they were silenced by social shame, by legal indifference, by a system that told them their pain and trauma didn't matter. Segment 10. Human Medical Experimentation Without Consent. In this final segment, we'll examine human medical experimentation conducted without consent. This was an era when the advancement of medical science was considered so important that individual rights and bodily autonomy were completely disregarded, especially for the most vulnerable members of society. Let's begin with the absence of any consent doctrine in medicine. There was simply no legal requirement for informed consent. The very concept didn't exist in law. Patients, especially the poor or those held in institutions, were seen as legally incompetent to refuse medical procedures. Doctors held unchecked authority under hospital bylaws or through property ownership rights. Common law, the body of judge-made legal principles, viewed surgery on unconscious patients or on wards, people under institutional care, as entirely permissible. The law prioritized scientific progress over individual autonomy. The thinking was that advancing medical knowledge would benefit humanity as a whole, and that benefit outweighed any harm to individual patients who were used as experimental subjects. People had no legal right to control what was done to their own bodies if they were in a doctor's care in the United States South before the Civil War. Enslaved people were used as experimental subjects in particularly horrifying ways. Slave owners legally authorized experiments on enslaved individuals because enslaved people were treated as property. They had no legal standing to refuse or to seek recourse afterward. Medical schools purchased enslaved people's bodies for live dissections or drug tests. The Virginia Medical College in the 1840s used enslaved children for syphilis trials. Doctors deliberately infected children with syphilis to study the progression of the disease. They documented their results in medical journals without any ethical qualms whatsoever. These publications were read and cited by other doctors. This was considered legitimate scientific research. Prisoners and convicts were also systematically exploited for medical experimentation. Jails and prisons supplied bodies for surgical innovations. British and United States penal systems allowed wardens to consent on behalf of inmates for what were called therapeutic procedures, though many of these procedures were purely experimental with no therapeutic benefit. Philadelphia's Eastern State Penitentiary in the 1830s hosted early tests of ether anesthesia on chained prisoners. The doctors who conducted these tests published their findings as medical breakthroughs. They were celebrated for their innovations. The fact that they had experimented on captive human beings who couldn't refuse was not considered problematic. The hospitalized poor and orphans faced similar treatment. Workhouse infirmaries and charity hospitals experimented on indigent patients who couldn't pay for their care and therefore had no power to refuse treatment. Children in orphanages faced untested vaccines or experimental surgeries that were justified as being for their benefit. London's Guy's Hospital in the 1800s performed what were essentially vivisections, cutting into living patients' limbs to study anatomy and test surgical techniques on paupers who were receiving charity care. The hospital's board of trustees approved these experiments as serving the public good. The individual suffering of the patients was considered an acceptable price for advancing medical knowledge. One of the most infamous cases of experimental surgery was J. Marion Sims' vesicovaginal fistula operations. Sims is sometimes called the father of modern gynecology, but his pioneering work was built on the bodies of enslaved women. Between 1845 and 1849 in Alabama, Sims performed over 30 unanesthetized surgeries on enslaved women named Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy, among others. He was perfecting a repair for vesicovaginal fistulas, tears between the vagina and bladder that caused constant leaking and were often a result of traumatic childbirth. He performed repeated incisions without pain relief. Anesthesia existed. By this time, but Sims believed that black women didn't feel pain the same way white women did, a racist pseudoscientific belief that was common at the time. He later wrote about his work as an example of scientific perseverance and was celebrated for his medical innovations. This was legally unassailable because it was sanctioned by the women's owners. They were property, and property could be used however the owner saw fit. Beyond surgery, doctors conducted bloodletting and toxin trials that were often fatal. Doctors tested extreme phlebotomy, draining quarts of blood from patients, or administered mercury and calomel, which are poisons to fever patients. They claimed this was empirical necessity, that they needed to test these treatments to see if they worked. Patient consent was never considered. Cholera experiments in Vienna in the 1830s drew blood from hundreds of poor volunteers who had been recruited from the streets, though volunteer is questionable when you're desperately poor and offered payment. About 50% of these subjects died from the experiments. The doctors documented the deaths as part of their data. Early vaccine and serum development involved enormous risks that were borne entirely by vulnerable populations. Before modern vaccination, there was a practice called variolation for smallpox, where people were deliberately infected with live pus from smallpox lesions in the hope of creating a mild case that would confer immunity. This was tested on enslaved people and paupers. Edward Jenner's 1796 development of the cowpox vaccine, which was much safer, was still scratched into the arms of orphans without any prior safety trials. The United States Marine Hospital in the 1840s injected yellow fever serum into Irish immigrants to see if it would provide immunity. Dozens died in these controlled exposures. The doctors knew they were exposing people to a deadly disease. They just believed the potential knowledge gained justified the deaths. Many surgical firsts, procedures that had never been attempted before, were performed on the most marginalized people. The first ovariotomy, the surgical removal of an ovary, was performed on poor women in the 1830s in the United States without anesthesia. Early lithotomies, surgeries to remove bladder stones, were similarly performed on patients who had no choice in the matter. Edinburgh's Royal Infirmary used Irish famine refugees, people who were starving and desperate, for demonstrations of ether anesthesia. No liability attached to any of this. Hospitals claimed what they called experimental privilege, the right to experiment on patients in the name of advancing. Medical science thought the morbidity from these experiments was severe and often covered up. High death rates, often between 20 and 50% in early surgeries, were logged simply as complications, not as malpractice or as the predictable result of experimental procedures. Survivors often bore terrible scars, suffered infections, or were left sterile. They received no compensation. Sims' patients, the enslaved women he operated on repeatedly, endured sepsis, severe infections, over and over again. Yet he faced no professional censure. He wasn't criticized by other doctors. He wasn't sanctioned by medical boards. He was celebrated. There were some precursors to ethical awakening, though real change took a long time. In the 1840s, a French physiologist named Claude Bernard began to write about some limits on animal experimentation, hinting that perhaps there should be ethical boundaries. But meaningful change didn't come until the 20th century, after the horrors of Nazi medical experiments led to the Nuremberg Code in 1947, which established principles for ethical human experimentation. In the 1890s, movements for laboratory animal welfare in the United States began to create analogies to human subjects. The idea that if we should protect animals from unnecessary suffering in experiments, perhaps we should protect humans as well. The legacy of 19th century medical experimentation is that it laid the foundation for modern informed consent laws. Today, conducting medical experiments on people without their informed consent is criminalized as assault and as a violation of human rights. But it took well over a century of abuse before the law recognized that people have a right to control what happens to their own bodies, even in the name of medical progress. What we see in this history is how the law can enable systematic dehumanization when certain groups are deemed less important than others. Enslaved people, prisoners, the poor, orphans, immigrants, all were treated as experimental material rather than as human beings with rights. The law gave doctors and institutions complete power over these vulnerable populations and provided no recourse for victims. Medical science advanced, certainly. We learned things that still benefit people today. But that knowledge was built on suffering that was entirely preventable, on the violation of people who had no choice, no voice, and no protection. The law could have prevented this. It could have required consent, could have imposed oversight, could have held experimenters accountable for harm. Instead, it facilitated the abuse by treating vulnerable people as legally available for any use that authorities decided served a greater good. And so we've reached the end of our journey through the 1800s. We've explored 10 different systems of exploitation and violence, 100 facts that reveal how the law once protected practices we now recognize as crimes. Slavery and colonial, exploitation, judicial torture and corporal punishment, deadly working conditions and child labor, domestic violence and marital rape, medical experimentation without consent. All of it legal, all of it operating in plain sight, justified by the legal systems of the most powerful nations on earth. These weren't accidents or aberrations. They were the law working as designed, protecting property and power, treating vulnerable people as less than fully human. But they also show us something hopeful. Every single one of these practices was eventually challenged and changed. The law evolved because people demanded it evolve. Activists, reformers, survivors, and ordinary citizens who refused to accept that legal meant moral. As you drift off to sleep tonight, carry that understanding with you. History isn't just something that happened in the past. It's a reminder that the present is always being shaped by choices we make. That injustice often hides behind the language of law and order, and that change is always possible when people have the courage to demand it. Rest well, sleep deeply, and remember that understanding the past helps us build a better future.